There's one thing that everybody in the industry has been talking about, and we all know that's digital public infrastructure. Last year at the Responsible Finance Forum in Bangalore, that came up as one of the key agendas that everybody in the room wanted to talk about. It emerged as one of the key themes that the G20 is focusing on, that the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion is focusing on. There's a lot of excitement. It looks like everybody in the industry is talking about it. What are your thoughts?
It's the term that I've heard everybody use. We often don't think about the underlying rails of what helps deliver digital financial services. And it's an interesting shift to thinking about the rails because they obviously have an impact on what can be delivered and the outcomes on consumers. I did want to ask you though, because we've been working on this for a bit, and one of the arguments that we've heard constantly is that it's a term that's commonly used, but it's one whose definition is not clearly understood. As somebody that's thought about it quite a bit, how do you assess whether something qualifies as DPI or not?
It's a good question, and I think we have to acknowledge that that's a rapidly evolving concept. There's not a firm definition. It continuously integrates new layers and expands both vertically and horizontally to new sectors. Finance is not the only component of DPI. Now we're talking about agriculture, healthcare, so it's expanding a lot. There will come a point where we must assess critically whether this is a useful concept. The moment we're talking about the definition, and we don't talk about whether that is actually useful, that whether that has an impact on the market, on the consumers themselves, I believe that the usefulness of the concept is to be questioned. Right now, existing research defines DPI broadly as a set of protocols and open technology standards that are used both by public sector and private sector to foster innovation at a societal scale. That's a very broad definition. I mean, many things can be included under that. For us that are focused on inclusive finance, the layers of DPI that seems to be most relevant at the moment are the layer of digital ID. So we have examples from India and from Estonia that are very, very important. We have a layer of digital payments. And again, India with UPI, Brazil with PIX are very important examples that people are talking about. And finally, there's the layer of data exchange. That includes initiatives such as open banking, for example, open finance, and even open data across different sectors. I think that's a very important layer that we'll talk about more and more in the future. Among these many different ways to think about DPI, I found particularly useful the approach that David Porteous and other authors have identified. Rather than pinning down a single definition for what DPI is, which is very difficult, what they do is essentially they define a definitional space. They say for each of the term digital public infrastructure, there's a broader and a narrower interpretation of what that means. There are two tests that they suggest, and I think they're quite important because that they help us kind of frame the thinking. One is what they call the multilateral access test. Essentially, when a solution is provided by a single provider, then would not fall under the definition of infrastructure. When a solution is provided by a range of different providers, then it does. For example, in Kenya, M-Pesa is widely used, but it's provided by a single operator, a single telco, right? The Safaricom. So M-Pesa would not fall under the definition. In Kenya, there's another solution called PesaLink. It's not as widely used, but it's provided by a banking association and by various banks within the Kenyan market. And that, according to this test, will fall under the definition of the DPI. I think that's a useful kind of guidance that can be used. The other test, which is also important, is what is called the operational responsibility test. Essentially, is there an organization, an institution that has the mandate for the functioning of the digital public infrastructure? If the answer is no, then maybe we're talking about technology, we're talking about protocol, we're not talking about digital public infrastructure. For example, on the data exchange layer, when you think about open banking initiatives in Brazil, in India, in the UK, where there are agencies, there are institutions, there are governance mechanisms that are clearly defined through institutions such as Sahamati in India, for example, or the OBIE in the UK. When there are such organizations that have the responsibility for open banking, then this falls under the definition of DPI. In other contexts where open banking, essentially the exchange of data, is fully market-driven, there's not one organization, institution, agency at the back that is responsible for it, then that will not fall under the definition. So we see it's a very complicated space, and I'm sure we'll be talking more about it. But even leaving the definition debate on the side for now, You've done a lot of research. I wanted to get a sense from you. What do you think are the key findings from the study that we've just done? What do you think we should be talking about more other than the definition itself?
Our research, it's a landscape study, so it's thrown up that there are several open questions that remain unanswered at each of the three layers that you described, whether it's digital ID, or it's the payments layer, or it's the data exchange layer. We've classified these open questions into 4 buckets. So there are governance questions that need to be answered. Who is held responsible? Who creates the safeguards? How do we respect citizen rights? So that's the second bucket. How do we promote innovation and make sure that some of this is financially sustainable in the long run? And this is particularly important when we think about countries that may be quite different from the exemplar countries we've seen so far, which is India and Brazil, where resources might be a challenge or capacity constraints might exist at the regulatory level or the state level. And the fourth one, which I find particularly interesting, is the impact on outcomes from implementing DPI. And I find that quite crucial because there are billions of dollars that are today flowing into scaling up digital public infrastructure in the way that we've seen it in the 2 countries that have a significantly large population. And I think it's quite important to pause and check if there are adequate safeguards to make sure that it's not going to have unintended consequences that potentially can be addressed upfront. So I'm excited about this paper because I think it'll be a foundational paper for a much, much longer body of work that we'll kick off. But you've been thinking about several of these questions too, so what excites you?
I think there's many areas of the digital public infrastructure debate that I'm excited about. Personally, I've been very keen to learn more about the data exchange layer. That's an area that we've discussed, not under the umbrella of DPI, but more under the term of open banking and open finance. I mean, there's a couple of elements there that we will be focused on more in the future. I think on the one hand, we are increasingly realizing that the business models emerging from open banking have potential, but they yet have to reach those segments of the population that we are aiming to serve through inclusive financial services. So there is definitely some work that needs to be done in terms of how can these business models be designed so that we're able to target the smaller businesses, the households that currently are underserved or excluded from the financial sector. The other element that is important is within the definition of open banking essentially is the sharing of banking data or financial sector data. So by definition, those people who are excluded or that are underserved by the financial sector, they don't have data to exchange in the first place. So it's very difficult to think about how can business models reach the last mile if they're excluded from producing these data trails. To me, the big questions that we'll be discussing more in the future is around what are the data trails that are not necessarily financial sector data trails. Maybe they're linked to their livelihoods, maybe they're linked to their agriculture activities, or maybe they're linked to their use of energy or participation in the digital economy. Those data trails will become increasingly important as part of the broader ecosystem. And to me, that's how open banking, open finance will achieve the scale that we hope it will achieve. Right now, it seems to be more something that has potential, but that potential is not yet being realized.
We're going to present all of this at the Responsible Finance Forum on July 2nd and 3rd in Fortaleza, Brazil. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you see this body of work evolving. So there's the foundational paper, we've done a couple of other pieces. What next?
There are many areas I think that deserve more attention. I think one that I'm particularly keen to investigate is around what are the hidden costs that we may not be seeing right now, but they may materialize over the long term. Because right now, these are all new initiatives. So we can see the short-term outcomes, but we don't know over the long term at a market level what the effects will be of these new technologies, the new infrastructures. One of the areas that I think deserve more attention is there a risk for crowding out of private sector investments? We don't have an answer to that. That's something that we'll need to investigate more. But I think it's something that may materialize over a longer period of time. It's not something that will happen immediately. And I think the more we look into this DPI questions, that's something that we'll have to focus on more. There's a question whether digital public infrastructure essentially will lead to more concentrated markets, like fewer options for consumers. I think it's too early to say. I have to say markets are concentrated anyway, regardless of whether DPI is there or not. That's a question that I think will take a longer time for us to assess, but it's one of those that we may want to focus on more going forward. What do you think are critical research agendas, in particular on the consumer protection front? Is there anything that you think should be prioritized?
I would say that we need to examine the incentives to continue investing in consumer protection measures. And part of that would come from upgrading the underlying code, making sure that the system itself is agile to newer risks that we see on the horizon. So cyber attacks, I think cyber security risks are something that people think about all the time. But also beyond that, what are the oblique consumer protection risks that are rising because people are, using digital financial services and leaving data trails all over the place. And I'd like to see more resources flowing towards that. But this was great. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and for having this conversation.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.